August 7, 1942. The humid air of Guadalcanal hangs heavy with the acrid smell of cordite and death. Through the palm trees, a Japanese reconnaissance patrol moves silently toward what remains of an American supply depot, their boots sinking into the blood-soaked earth. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka motions for his squad to halt as they approach the scattered wreckage of olive-drab trucks, their canvas tops shredded by mortar fragments. In the oppressive heat of the Solomon Islands, these men, sons of rice farmers and factory workers, expect to find the usual spoils of war: ammunition, medical supplies, perhaps some of the tasteless American rations they have heard about from prisoners. What they discover instead will shatter everything they believe about their enemy, their war, and their emperor's promise of inevitable victory. In the back of a damaged supply truck, beneath twisted metal and splintered wood, Tanaka's flashlight beam falls upon something extraordinary. Dozens of glass bottles, still cold to the touch despite the tropical heat, each one containing a dark liquid that fizzes and bubbles when disturbed. The bottles bear a strange curved script and an unfamiliar red and white label. These Japanese soldiers, raised on discipline, sacrifice, and the bitter taste of pine needle tea, are about to encounter Coca-Cola, and with it, the devastating realization of American industrial abundance that their leaders have desperately tried to hide from them. This moment of discovery on Guadalcanal represents far more than thirsty soldiers finding refreshment in the chaos of battle. It marks the beginning of a psychological awakening that would prove more destructive to Japanese morale than any bombing campaign or naval blockade. For these men, trained to believe that suffering and deprivation were virtues that would lead to ultimate victory, the simple act of tasting an ice-cold Coca-Cola would reveal the terrible truth about the war they were fighting, a truth so dangerous that Japanese commanders would eventually classify information about American soft drinks as a military secret. The Japanese High Command had constructed an elaborate fiction about their American enemies, painting them as soft, undisciplined, and morally corrupted nation of pleasure seekers who would crumble at the first taste of hardship. This propaganda served a crucial purpose. It helped explain how Japan, with its limited industrial capacity and scarce resources, could hope to defeat the world's largest economy. Japanese soldiers were taught that American materialism was a weakness, that their own willingness to endure suffering and make sacrifices would overcome any technological or numerical disadvantage. The discovery of refrigerated Coca-Cola in American supply trucks threatened to expose this propaganda as a dangerous lie. Tanaka uncaps one of the bottles, and the distinctive hiss of carbonation escapes into the jungle air. The liquid is darker than tea, sweeter than anything most of these men have tasted since childhood, and impossibly cold in a climate where ice is a forgotten luxury. As word spreads through the patrol, each soldier takes a tentative sip, their faces registering surprise, confusion, and something approaching awe. Here, thousands of miles from America, in the middle of a war zone, their enemies have somehow managed to deliver ice-cold soft drinks to their frontline troops. The implications are staggering and immediate. These Japanese soldiers had been surviving on daily rations of barely 1,200 calories, mostly rice, dried fish, and whatever jungle vegetation they could forage. Many had not seen sugar in months. Their uniforms were patched and repatched, their equipment worn and improvised. They had been told that such hardships were the price of righteousness, that American soldiers were too pampered and comfortable to endure similar privations. Yet here was evidence that American supply lines could not only deliver the necessities of war to remote Pacific islands, but could do so with such efficiency and abundance that luxury items, carbonated beverages, that served no military purpose were treated as routine provisions. The psychological impact of this discovery extended far beyond the immediate pleasure of a cold drink. For soldiers raised in a culture that prized stoic endurance of suffering, the casual abundance represented by Coca-Cola challenged fundamental assumptions about strength, virtue, and destiny. If Americans could afford to ship luxury beverages to combat zones, what did that say about their industrial capacity? If they could maintain cold storage in tropical climates, while Japanese forces struggled to preserve basic medical supplies, what did that reveal about their technological sophistication? Most disturbing of all, If American soldiers fought effectively while enjoying such comforts, what did that mean for the Japanese belief that hardship and sacrifice were prerequisites for military virtue? As news of these discoveries spread through Japanese forces in the Pacific, patterns began to emerge that would profoundly disturb military intelligence officers. American supply depots invariably contain not just the expected military equipment, but an astonishing array of consumer goods that seem to serve no strategic purpose. Chocolate bars, chewing gum, cigarettes, magazines, and yes, Coca-Cola, all delivered with the same efficiency and regularity as ammunition and fuel. To Japanese commanders accustomed to logistic systems that barely managed to provide basic rations, this abundance seemed almost incomprehensible. The bottles themselves became objects of fascination and study. Unlike the simple utilitarian containers used for Japanese beverages, Coca-Cola bottles were works of industrial artistry, perfectly formed glass with raised lettering, designed not just to contain liquid, but to appeal to the eye and hand. The carbonation process, which created the distinctive fizz and required sophisticated bottling equipment, demonstrated a level of manufacturing precision that impressed even veteran engineers among the Japanese forces. Each bottle represented not just a drink, but a complete industrial ecosystem capable of producing, bottling, refrigerating, and distributing millions of units across vast distances. Captain Yoshimitsu Yamada, a logistics officer with the 32nd Army on Okinawa, would later write in his diary about encountering an abandoned American field kitchen in April 1945. Among the equipment we found not just the expected cooking facilities, but mechanical refrigeration units maintaining dozens of Coca-Cola bottles at perfect serving temperature. While our men have not seen ice in 8 months, the Americans treat cold beverages as a basic necessity. How can we hope to defeat an enemy with such casual abundance? This entry, recovered after the war, captures the growing sense of futility that such discoveries engendered among Japanese forces. The refrigeration aspect proved particularly demoralizing. Japanese forces in the Pacific had long since abandoned any hope of keeping perishable goods cold. Medical supplies spoiled in the tropical heat, food rotted within days, and ice was a memory from a different world. Yet American supply trucks routinely carried portable refrigeration units capable of maintaining proper temperatures for both essential supplies and comfort items. The technology itself was not mysterious. The Japanese understood the principles of mechanical cooling, but the casual deployment of such energy-intensive equipment in forward combat areas revealed a level of resource abundance that seemed almost magical. One of the most psychologically devastating aspects of these encounters was the realization that Coca-Cola was not a rare luxury reserved for American officers, but was distributed democratically to ordinary soldiers. Japanese military culture was rigidly hierarchical, with privileges and comforts distributed according to rank. The idea that American privates had access to the same cold beverages as their generals challenged Japanese assumptions about military organization and social order. If America could afford to provide luxury items to its lowest-ranking soldiers, what resources must be available to their elite units? The systematic nature of American beverage distribution became apparent through multiple encounters across different theaters of the Pacific War. From the Philippines to the Marshall Islands, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, Japanese forces consistently discovered American supply caches containing Coca-Cola alongside ammunition and medical supplies. This was not the result of occasional supply windfalls or special circumstances, but represented a deliberate, systematic effort to provide comfort items to American forces. The Coca-Cola Company had essentially mobilized its entire industrial capacity for the war effort, establishing bottling plants across the Pacific to ensure that American troops would never be without their familiar soft drink. By 1943, Coca-Cola had constructed 64 bottling plants in war zones around the world, producing over 5 billion bottles for American forces. The scale of this operation boggled Japanese military planners, who were struggling to maintain basic communication and supply lines across their shrinking Pacific Empire. The company had even created a special military division, staffed by technical observers who wore military uniforms and held officer-equivalent ranks, whose sole mission was to establish Coca-Cola production facilities wherever American forces operated. To Japanese intelligence officers trying to understand American capabilities, this seemed like an impossible misallocation of resources until they began to grasp the true scale of American industrial capacity. The impact of these discoveries was amplified by the Japanese military's own increasingly desperate supply situation. By 1944, Japanese forces throughout the Pacific were experiencing severe shortages of everything from ammunition to medical supplies to basic food rations. Soldiers were reduced to eating bark, roots, and whatever else they could forage. Against this backdrop of deprivation, the discovery of American troops enjoying ice-cold soft drinks created a psychological contrast that was almost unbearable. It was not just that the Americans had more resources, it was that they had so many resources they could afford to waste them on non-essential items. The carbonated beverage became a symbol of everything Japanese propaganda had claimed was wrong with American society: decadence, materialism, and the pursuit of pleasure over duty. Yet the consistent presence of Coca-Cola in American supply lines and the evident fighting effectiveness of American troops who consumed it forced an agonizing reappraisal of these assumptions. If Americans could fight effectively while enjoying such luxuries, perhaps the Japanese emphasis on suffering and sacrifice was not the military advantage their leaders claimed it to be. This psychological warfare aspect of American abundance was not entirely accidental. American military leaders understood that the contrast between American plenty and Japanese scarcity could be as demoralizing to enemy forces as any conventional weapon. The decision to maintain luxuries like Coca-Cola in forward supply areas served multiple purposes. It maintained American morale, demonstrated American industrial capacity to ally and enemy alike, and forced enemy forces to confront the reality of their disadvantageous position in a war of production and logistics. Individual testimonies from Japanese prisoners of war captured the profound psychological impact of encountering American abundance. Lieutenant Masao Nishimura, shot down over the Philippines in October 1944, described his first experience with Coca-Cola after being captured. "I expected torture, humiliation, perhaps death. Instead, they gave me food better than our officers ate, medical care superior to our own hospitals, and a cold drink I had never tasted. The sweetness was overwhelming, not just the taste, but the realization that our enemies had such abundance they could offer luxury to prisoners while our own soldiers starved." The cold temperature of the Coca-Cola was particularly significant in tropical combat zones where both sides suffered from the oppressive heat. Japanese forces had adapted to warm beverages and room temperature water as a basic reality of Pacific warfare. The discovery that Americans had somehow solved the problem of keeping beverages cold in such conditions represented a quantum leap in battlefield comfort that had obvious implications for combat effectiveness. Dehydration and heat exhaustion were constant problems for Japanese troops. The American ability to provide cold, refreshing beverages suggested a level of logistical sophistication that gave them significant advantages in tropical warfare. The manufacturing quality of Coca-Cola also provided insights into American industrial capabilities that proved deeply troubling to Japanese engineers and technical specialists. The bottles were uniform in size and shape, the carbonation levels were consistent, and the flavor remained stable across vast distances and varying storage conditions. This level of quality control required sophisticated manufacturing processes, extensive quality assurance systems, and reliable supply chains that could maintain standards across thousands of miles of ocean. For Japanese forces struggling to maintain consistency in basic military equipment production, the implications were clear. America's industrial base was not just larger, but fundamentally more advanced. As the war progressed and Japanese territorial losses mounted, encounters with American supply caches became more frequent and more demoralizing. Each discovery of Coca-Cola represented not just a momentary pleasure for thirsty soldiers, but a reminder of the increasingly hopeless nature of their position. The bottles, with their distinctive shape and American branding, became tangible symbols of enemy superiority that Japanese forces could hold in their hands and taste on their tongues. The psychological impact was compounded by the knowledge that these luxury items were reaching American forces through the same supply lines that delivered weapons, ammunition, and fuel. The integration of comfort items into essential military logistics demonstrated a level of systematic thinking and resource allocation that Japanese commanders found both impressive and terrifying. It suggested that American military planning operated on a scale and with a sophistication that Japanese forces, with their more limited resources and increasingly improvised supply systems, could not hope to match. The contrast became even more stark as Japanese forces began to suffer from systematic supply failures throughout 1944 and 1945. While American troops continued to receive regular deliveries of Coca-Cola, Japanese soldiers were reduced to manufacturing weapons from scrap metal and brewing pine needle tea for sustenance. The psychological effect of this disparity was evident in declining morale reports and increasing rates of surrender among Japanese forces who had previously preferred death to capture. Intelligence officers within the Japanese military began to recognize the propaganda value of American abundance and took steps to suppress information about discoveries like the Coca-Cola finds. Orders were issued forbidding discussion of American luxury items among the troops, and reports about enemy supply caches were edited to remove references to non-military goods. This attempt at information control reflected a growing awareness that knowledge of American abundance was as dangerous to Japanese fighting spirit as any enemy weapon. The suppression efforts, however, could not completely contain the spread of information or the psychological impact of direct encounters. Soldiers who had tasted Coca-Cola inevitably shared their experiences with comrades, and each new discovery of American supply caches reinforced the growing realization that Japan was fighting a war it could not win. The carbonated beverage became a touchstone for discussions about American capabilities and Japanese prospects, mentioned in letters home when censorship permitted, and in conversations among trusted friends. By the final year of the war, the symbolic power of Coca-Cola in American supply lines had become so significant that Japanese commanders actively sought to prevent their troops from encountering American supply caches intact. Orders were issued to destroy enemy supplies immediately upon capture, without examination or inventory. This policy reflected a recognition that the psychological damage from discovering American abundance might outweigh any tactical advantage gained from capture materials. The industrial logistics behind Coca-Cola distribution also provided Japanese intelligence with unwelcome insights into American strategic capabilities. The fact that America could afford to dedicate shipping space, manufacturing capacity, and logistical coordination to non-essential beverage distribution, while simultaneously supporting massive military operations across multiple theaters, revealed a level of industrial surplus that Japanese planners had not anticipated. Their calculations about American resource allocation had assumed that wartime priorities would force Americans to eliminate luxury consumption. The discovery that luxury items were actually being integrated into military supply systems forced a fundamental reassessment of American productive capacity. The refrigeration technology required to keep Coca-Cola cold in tropical conditions also demonstrated American technical capabilities that had strategic implications beyond beverage distribution. The same refrigeration systems that kept soft drinks cold could preserve vaccines, maintain food supplies, and store sensitive equipment. The casual deployment of such technology in forward areas suggested that American forces possessed a level of logistical infrastructure that gave them significant advantages in sustained operations. As individual Japanese soldiers were captured and interrogated by American forces, their responses to simple offerings of food and drink provided American intelligence officers with insights into the psychological impact of the supply disparities. Many prisoners expressed amazement not just at the availability of items like Coca-Cola, but at the casual manner in which they were offered. The implication that such luxuries were so abundant they could be shared with prisoners contradicted everything these soldiers had been taught about American resource constraints and wartime privation. The democratic distribution of Coca-Cola among American forces also challenged Japanese understanding of American military organization. In the Japanese system, privileges and comforts were carefully distributed according to hierarchy, with lower-ranking soldiers expected to endure hardships that officers were spared. The discovery that American privates had access to the same cold beverages as their sergeants and lieutenants suggested a fundamentally different approach to military organization, one that prioritized overall effectiveness over traditional hierarchical privileges. This revelation had broader implications for Japanese understanding of American society and its war-fighting capabilities. If Americans could maintain high morale and fighting effectiveness while providing luxury items to all ranks, it suggested that their approach to military organization might be more effective than the rigid hierarchical system that Japan had inherited from centuries of samurai tradition. The possibility that egalitarian distribution of comforts might actually enhance rather than undermine military discipline was a concept that challenged fundamental Japanese assumptions about leadership and motivation. The presence of Coca-Cola in American supply lines also provided evidence of the deep integration between American civilian industry and military operations. The Coca-Cola Company's commitment to serving military personnel represented a mobilization of civilian resources for war purposes that went far beyond simple government contracts. This public-private cooperation suggested a level of national unity and industrial coordination that Japanese leaders had not anticipated when they decided to attack Pearl Harbor. As Japanese resistance crumbled in the Pacific Islands throughout 1944 and 1945, the symbolic significance of abandoned American supply caches grew even more powerful. Each discovery of intact Coca-Cola stocks represented not just immediate refreshment for exhausted Japanese soldiers, but tangible proof that American forces had been operating with such confidence and abundance that they could afford to abandon luxury items rather than evacuate them. The psychological impact of finding perfectly preserved soft drinks in areas where Japanese forces had been reduced to eating roots and bark was devastating to morale. The sound of carbonation escaping from open bottles became associated in Japanese military memory with a moment of recognition, the hiss of gas, that accompanied the realization that everything they had been told about American weakness and resource constraints was propaganda designed to maintain fighting spirit in a hopeless cause. This auditory signature of American abundance would haunt veterans' memories long after the war ended, a sensory reminder of the moment when illusions about victory were shattered by the simple act of opening a bottle of Coca-Cola. The broader implications of American beverage abundance extended beyond individual psychological impact to strategic and operational considerations. Japanese military planners had based their war strategy on assumptions about American resource limitations and the unsustainability of fighting simultaneous campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. The discovery that Americans could maintain luxury consumption even in forward combat areas suggested that these assumptions were fundamentally flawed. If America could afford to provide non-essential comfort items to troops fighting on remote Pacific islands, what did that say about their capacity to sustain long-term military operations? The cultural dimensions of the Coca-Cola encounters also proved significant. 4 Japanese soldiers raised in a society that valued austerity and the aesthetic of simplicity. The sweet, heavily flavored American beverage represented a completely different approach to pleasure and consumption. The complexity of the flavor, the interplay of sweetness, acidity, and carbonation seemed almost decadent compared to the simple, subtle tastes of traditional Japanese beverages. This sensory contrast reinforced broader cultural differences that Japanese propaganda had portrayed as American weakness, but which combat experience was revealing to be sources of American strength. The medical implications of adequate nutrition and hydration, as demonstrated by American ability to provide refreshing beverages to troops, also became apparent to Japanese medical officers. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, and nutritional deficiencies were significant problems for Japanese forces operating in tropical conditions. The American emphasis on maintaining troop comfort through provisions like cold beverages represented not just luxury, but sound military medicine. Well-hydrated, properly nourished soldiers were more effective fighters, a lesson that Japanese forces learned too late in the war. The supply chain analysis that Japanese intelligence officers conducted around American beverage distribution revealed the sophisticated logistics networks that supported American military operations. The ability to maintain cold storage, ensure product quality, and distribute consumer goods across vast Pacific distances required coordination between multiple industrial sectors, transportation systems, and military supply organizations. This integration of civilian and military logistics capabilities gave Americans advantages that extended far beyond beverage distribution to encompass all aspects of sustained military operations. Documentation recovered from Japanese military archives after the war revealed the extent to which discoveries of American abundance influenced strategic thinking at the highest levels. Staff officers charged with assessing American capabilities began incorporating evidence of luxury goods distribution into their estimates of enemy industrial capacity. The presence of items like Coca-Cola in American supply inventories became data points in calculations about American resource allocation and warfighting sustainability. The psychological operations potential of American abundance was not lost on Japanese propaganda specialists, who recognized that knowledge of enemy luxury consumption could undermine domestic morale, as well as military fighting spirit. Instructions were issued to censors to remove references to American abundance from soldiers' letters home, and efforts were made to control the narrative around captured American supplies. These information control measures reflected an understanding that the truth about American industrial capacity was as dangerous to Japanese war effort as any enemy weapon. The transformation of individual Japanese soldiers who encountered American abundance extended beyond immediate psychological impact to fundamental changes in worldview and ideology. Men who had been raised to believe in the superiority of Japanese discipline and sacrifice found themselves confronting evidence that a different approach to military organization and social structure might be more effective. The cognitive dissonance created by these encounters forced many to question not just military propaganda, but broader assumptions about Japanese society and its relationship to the modern world. The post-war testimonies of Japanese veterans who had encountered American supply abundance during the war revealed the lasting impact of these experiences. Many described the moment of tasting Coca-Cola as a turning point in their understanding of the war and their country's prospects. The sweetness of the beverage became associated in memory with the bitterness of recognizing that everything they had been told about American weakness was false. The industrial mobilization represented by Coca-Cola distribution also provided insights into American approaches to morale and motivation that challenged Japanese assumptions about military effectiveness. The Japanese military tradition emphasized endurance of hardship as a character-building and unit-bonding experience. The American willingness to provide comfort items to troops suggested a different philosophy, that maintaining high morale through provision of familiar pleasures might be more effective than building character through shared suffering. The global scope of American beverage distribution became apparent as Japanese forces encountered Coca-Cola supplies in locations from Alaska to Australia, from the Philippines to Panama. This ubiquity demonstrated not just industrial capacity, but strategic vision, the understanding that maintaining troop morale through familiar comforts would pay dividends in combat effectiveness across all theaters of operation. The standardization of American military supply systems, which ensured that troops received similar provisions regardless of their location, contrasted sharply with Japanese supply arrangements that varied dramatically based on local conditions and available resources. The technical specifications required for maintaining carbonated beverages in tropical conditions also revealed American engineering capabilities that had implications beyond food service. The refrigeration systems, quality control processes, and distribution networks needed to deliver Coca-Cola to remote Pacific outposts demonstrated mastery of industrial technologies that could be applied to military applications. Japanese engineers studying captured American equipment began to recognize that the same technical sophistication evident in beverage distribution was being applied to weapon systems, communication equipment, and logistical infrastructure. The final irony of the Japanese encounter with American soft drink abundance emerged in the post-war period, when many veterans of the Pacific War found themselves working to rebuild Japan with American assistance. The same industrial capabilities that had delivered Coca-Cola to remote Pacific battlefields were now dedicated to helping former enemies reconstruct their shattered nation. The carbonated beverage that had once symbolized the hopelessness of Japanese resistance became a symbol of American generosity and the possibility of redemption through cooperation rather than conflict. The economic implications of American beverage abundance also provided insights into the fundamental differences between American and Japanese approaches to resource allocation and industrial organization. The ability to maintain luxury production during wartime while simultaneously supporting massive military operations revealed an economic system capable of expansion and adaptation that Japanese planners had not anticipated. This economic flexibility, demonstrated in microcosm by Coca-Cola distribution, proved to be one of America's decisive advantages in a prolonged global conflict. The democratization of luxury, represented by widespread Coca-Cola distribution, also challenged Japanese understanding of American social structure and values. In Japanese society, access to luxury goods was carefully regulated by social hierarchy and economic status. The discovery that American military organization provided equal access to comfort items, regardless of rank, suggested a different approach to social organization that Japanese observers found both intriguing and disturbing. This egalitarian distribution of privileges contradicted Japanese assumptions about the relationship between social order and military effectiveness. In the steaming jungles of the Pacific, among the wreckage of supply trucks and the debris of shattered armies, the simple act of Japanese soldiers discovering refrigerated Coca-Cola had revealed a truth more powerful than any military intelligence report or strategic analysis. The war they were fighting was not a contest between different philosophies of discipline and sacrifice, but a collision between industrial systems so disparate that victory for the less capable side was not just unlikely but impossible. The carbonated hiss of an open Coca-Cola bottle became the sound of recognition the moment when propaganda gave way to reality, when hope surrendered to mathematics, and when the true cost of challenging American industrial abundance became undeniably clear. The dark liquid in those bottles carried more than sweetness and caffeine. It carried the bitter taste of truth about a war that had been lost before it began, decided not by courage or conviction, but by the cold calculus of productive capacity and the inexorable logic of industrial abundance. In discovering that their enemies could afford to provide luxury beverages to frontline troops while Japanese forces starved, these soldiers had encountered the fundamental asymmetry that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. The fizz of carbonation had become the sound of empire's end, the effervescent whisper of dreams dissolving in the harsh reality of American industrial supremacy.